The person on the other end of the phone seemed agitated. Ethan watched the typing bubble persist for 3 long minutes before he finally grew impatient and sent another message. He wrote that the tulips in the garden must be beautiful by now and that he missed him. This time, there was no text, only a voice note, the tone dripping with a possessive affection. Caleb's voice told him he knew that his little Ethan was more delicate than any tulip, and that everything had been arranged exactly to his liking. After the conversation ended, Ethan methodically cleared the message history, powered down the screen, and lay on the bed, turning restlessly. The housekeeper had already retired to her quarters, leaving the entire villa feeling cavernous and empty, with him as its solitary ghost. Moonlight filtered through a gap in the curtains, casting a cold, pallid glow on his wedding photograph with Caleb. The alpha was handsome, a roguish glint in his eyes that spoke of a careless disregard for the world. S-class alphas were born at the apex of the pyramid, indifferent to everything, yet Ethan had personally witnessed him become tender and pliant in the presence of another, lesser omega. The air was filled with the pleasant fragrance of roses, the same scent as Julian's pheromones. "I only want to lose myself in the scent of roses," Caleb had said, his words echoing in Ethan's memory as the gardener, following his instructions, uprooted the tulips from the garden. The pale white bulbs had been exposed to the scorching sun, gradually shriveling and turning a sickly yellow. They were much like his own tulip-scented gland, uncared for and destined to wither away. In 3 years of marriage, Caleb had refused to give him even a temporary mark. Ethan had managed with suppressants, but he never anticipated that a highly compatible S-class alpha and omega could conceive a child without a permanent bond. After the pregnancy, his craving for alpha pheromones became something no suppressant could quell. Just that day, he had fainted again from a severe bout of morning sickness and was taken to the hospital owned by Caleb's childhood friend. Ethan was already awake when Caleb arrived, but the nausea was so overwhelming that he couldn't face his husband's cold taunts. He chose to feign unconsciousness, a desperate act of self-preservation. He heard his husband's friend, Mark, sigh. It was a pity, Mark noted, that Caleb's wife was pregnant and unconscious. Yet he wouldn't even offer a mark. Caleb's reply was sharp, almost a snarl, questioning if Ethan was even worthy of it. If it weren't for Julian's fondness for his pheromones, Caleb claimed, he would have kicked him in the stomach long ago. Mark sounded incredulous, asking why he would get him pregnant then. Caleb had scoffed, comparing it to tossing a bone to an obedient dog. Mark's discomfort was audible. He called it cruel, reminding Caleb that Ethan was his lawfully wedded husband, carrying his child. This seemed to enrage Caleb. His voice rose, accusing Mark of siding with the old board members, of trying to force him to accept Ethan. High compatibility meant nothing, he spat. He would never be controlled by pheromones. In a few more days, Ethan would have to step aside. Ethan had thought his heart was a dead thing, but Caleb's words sent a sharp, agonizing pain through it. He had his pride too. When he was discharged, Ethan offered a polite thank you to the doctor, pretending not to notice the pity in the man's eyes. His fingers gently caressed his slightly swelling abdomen. The baby was all he needed. The next morning, Caleb was, for the first time in ages, sitting at the dining table for breakfast. Ethan hesitated, his feet feeling heavy, but Caleb's frigid gaze pinned him in place. He silently took a seat at the furthest end of the table. Caleb's knuckles tapped against his coffee mug, his wedding band glinting with a cold metallic sheen in the morning light. The scent of rain-soaked earth and roses clung to him, an invisible beast lunging at Ethan. Last night had been another passionate one for Caleb and Julian. A single year with Julian was enough to erase 3 years of marriage. Unsure if it was emotion or the high compatibility, a mist seemed to form over Ethan's eyes, blurring his vision. The mist turned to stone, pressing down on his chest. He ate his breakfast mechanically, the food tasting like ash. Caleb finished his meal and leisurely lit a cigarette. The acrid smoke filled the air, and Ethan couldn't suppress a cough. A cold sneer twisted Caleb's lips as he noticed the tears that had blurred Ethan's sight, fat drops splashing onto the fried egg on his plate. He rose and strode to Ethan's side, leaning in abruptly. A hand smelling of tobacco clamped onto his chin. He demanded to know who the pathetic act was for. Ethan's voice was a timid whisper, explaining that it wasn't intentional, but a rejection caused by the pheromones. The cigarette was extinguished on his untouched toast, leaving a scar like a centipede. Caleb announced that the doctor would be coming in the afternoon. The slam of the door startled the new young maid, causing her to drop a vase. He called back over his shoulder, ordering Ethan to keep his disgusting pheromones in check. "Mr. Lee, I'm so sorry," the young maid stammered, terrified by the shattered porcelain. The head housekeeper stood by, his face a mask of iron, looking as if he wanted to strike her. Ethan assured her it was fine, just a decoration. Seeing that he wouldn't pursue the matter, the housekeeper went about his other duties. It was a laughable irony. In Caleb's eyes, Ethan was a weed, but as long as he was his legal omega. Caleb wouldn't allow the staff to disrespect him, just as no one dared disrespect the family parrot. Blue. The maid cleaned up the mess, her round eyes welling with tears. Ethan was puzzled, telling her it was all right now, that there was no need to be so scared. But to his surprise, she burst into tears. She informed him that today was her last day. The housekeeper, though strict, was fair. Bullying wasn't an issue, and Caleb paid well. Her behavior was unusual, as if she had discovered a terrible secret and was being forced to leave. She seemed terrified of Caleb. Ethan sighed and handed her a tissue, asking if it was Caleb she was afraid of. She flinched, her voice trembling. She explained that, being new, she had accidentally entered the study to clean and had found a document. At this, she suddenly gripped Ethan's shoulders. "Mr. Lee, you have to leave," she urged. "If you don't, your gland and your child will belong to someone else. They're just using you as a vessel to produce a top-tier alpha." Following her frantic gesture, Ethan looked down at her phone. The screen was lit up, displaying a gland transplant consent form with his name signed at the bottom. For Julian, Caleb had stooped to forgery. Love truly made people lose control. The maid was still looking at him with worry, but Ethan calmly began to eat his bird's nest soup. He asked her name, and upon learning it was Maria, he gave her instructions. Before she left tomorrow, she was to take all the photographs, including the wedding portrait, to the incinerator and have them burned. He didn't want any image of himself left in this house. She asked if he was planning to leave. Ethan shook his head, then went and gathered all the jewelry he had bought for the wedding into a trash bag and handed it to her. He told her to take the bag and leave the city after dealing with the photos, and to remember that she was only leaving because she couldn't adapt to the job. She knew nothing about her employer's household. Finally, he added that while she was afraid of Caleb, she had never truly known him either. Another deep night fell. Caleb was out with Julian as usual. Ethan slipped into the study and retrieved a microcamera, no bigger than a new leaf bud, from inside the pot of a rose plant. The camera's lens was aimed directly at the desk. His fingertips were stained with the damp soil from the rose's roots. This particular rose had been a gift from Julian last year. Caleb would never think to inspect it. After this, he spent half an hour on the computer, expertly deleting the incriminating surveillance footage Caleb had set up and inserting a looped, harmless video in its place. Before bed, he received a secure message from across the ocean asking why he had removed the camera and if Caleb had discovered the surveillance. Ethan yawned languidly as he typed his reply. The show was ending. The character of Ethan was about to die, and the real Lee was coming home. Ethan stood by the birdcage, teasing Blue with a sunflower seed. "Come on, Blue," he cooed. The brilliant blue parrot tilted its head, its black bead eyes fixed on him, before flapping its wings and landing on his shoulder, rubbing its head affectionately against his cheek. "Ethan, Ethan," it squawked, mimicking the tone he had once taught it. He couldn't help but smile, gently stroking its soft feathers. Blue had been adopted when he and Caleb had just married. Back then, Caleb wasn't the cold man he was now. He would wrap his arms around Ethan's waist from behind as he fed the parrot, resting his chin on his shoulder and laughing lazily. "Ethan," he'd murmur, "try teaching him to say my name." Ethan would tease him, saying Caleb was a difficult name, suggesting Jerk instead. Caleb would chuckle, then suddenly nip his earlobe, his warm breath on his neck. "Teach him hubby," he'd whispered. The memory shattered. Julian's voice came from the doorway. "Ethan. Long time no see." Ethan's hand froze. Blue immediately bristled, a low growl rumbling in its throat. Julian sauntered in, the scent of roses instantly flooding the living room. He wore a light-colored V-neck sweater that accentuated his long neck, which was covered in a constellation of love bites, though there was no sign of a permanent mark. Ethan soothingly stroked Blue's head. "Thanks to you, I'm still alive," he said flatly. Julian let out a small laugh and sank into the sofa, his posture as languid as a spoiled cat's. "Caleb isn't home today. I came especially to see you." "To see me?" Ethan raised his eyes, his gaze falling on the watch on Julian's wrist, an antique piece of gold and gems that Caleb had won at an auction last month. "That's right," Julian said, dangling his wrist. "After all, the baby in your belly will have to call me Papa someday." The air turned to ice. Ethan stared at him, then laughed. He pointed out that while Caleb hadn't marked him, he hadn't given Julian a permanent mark either, likely finding his rank too low. Legally, Ethan reminded him he was still Caleb's lawful spouse. The law? Julian sounded as if he'd heard a joke. He leaned in close, his voice a low hiss. "Ethan, do you really think a piece of paper can protect you? Caleb has it all arranged. Soon, everything you have will be mine." Before he could finish, Blue shrieked, "Homewrecker." Startled, Julian recoiled, then lunged forward in a rage, intending to strike the parrot. "Who are you calling a homewrecker? The one who isn't loved is the third wheel." Ethan shielded Blue with his body, looking down at him. His voice was very soft. "Julian, you've only known him for a year. I've been married to him for 3. I know him better than you do." He took a deep breath, finally saying the words he'd held back for so long. "My husband, Caleb, is a man of low character and poor integrity. He resents me, the wife arranged by his elders, because it was a compromise he made when he was powerless. Once you take my place, your fate will be worse than mine. He won't be able to stand the gossip about him abandoning his first wife, and he'll project all of it onto you." Julian's face contorted with fury. He became frantic, clawing at the air like a cornered animal. "You're jealous. You're slandering him. He loves me, he would never do that." Startled, Blue let out a piercing scream, and its sharp talons raked across the back of Julian's hand. "Ah!" Julian cried out in pain as 3 bloody scratches appeared on his pale skin. Ethan immediately pulled Blue into his arms, glaring coldly at Julian. "You brought this on yourself." Julian stared daggers at him, then suddenly raised his voice. "Caleb, Look at him. Ethan froze and turned toward the door. Caleb was standing there, his face a thundercloud. He must have returned at some point. The air crackled with tension. Julian immediately ran to him, tears streaming down his face. Caleb, Ethan let his parrot attack me. Caleb glanced at the scratches on his hand, and his eyes turned glacial. Ethan. His voice was quiet but cut like a knife. Give me the bird. Clutching Blue tightly, Ethan took a step back. Julian started it. I said. Caleb advanced, his eyes blazing with fury. Give me the bird. Blue trembled in his arms, letting out frightened coos. Ethan stared defiantly at Caleb. What are you going to do? Caleb let out a cold laugh, snatched Blue away, and roughly gripped its neck. Caleb. Ethan lunged, but was shoved aside. It's just an animal. How dare it hurt Julian? Caleb looked down at the struggling parrot with disgust. Since it won't behave, I'll send it back to the circus. Ethan's blood ran cold. What? Caleb had already turned to leave, Julian flashing a triumphant smirk before hurrying after him. Caleb. Ethan grabbed his sleeve, his voice shaking. Blue was rescued from a circus because he developed depression there. We raised him together, you can't. We? Caleb violently shook off his hand, his gaze mocking. Ethan, who do you think you are? To use the word we? Ethan stood frozen. Caleb walked away without a backward glance. Blue thrashed in his grip, its shrill cries fading as they disappeared out the door. Ethan, Ethan, Daddy, Daddy. Ethan numbly opened his hand. A single blue feather, still warm, lay in his palm. The parrot only called him Daddy when it was utterly terrified. A hot tear fell, soaking the feather. Blue must be so scared right now. You took down the wedding photo? Ethan lay listlessly in bed, too exhausted to bother with Caleb. Sensing him approach, he pulled the covers over his head in annoyance. Get up. Stop playing dead. Or don't you care if that bird lives or dies? At those words, Ethan sat up, staring into the face he had dismembered 1,000 times in his dreams. What are your terms? The day after tomorrow. You'll accompany me deep-sea fishing. Fine. His unhesitating agreement seemed to surprise Caleb for a moment, followed by a cryptic smile. You certainly care a lot about that animal. Because even an animal has more decency than you. Ignoring the ugly turn of Caleb's expression, Ethan lay back down. Caleb stood by the bed in silence for a long time before finally leaving. Ethan relaxed, sinking into a deep sleep. It was raining on the day of the fishing trip. Ethan stared at the offshore consent form, its edges curled and damp from the rain. The ember of Caleb's cigarette glowed in the night, his eyes colder than the sea wind. Caleb, I agreed to go fishing, not to go into international waters. Sign it, he repeated, his shoe tapping impatiently against a metal cage. Blue was huddled at the bottom, its feathers plastered to its body, its right wing hanging at an unnatural angle. It heard Ethan's voice and struggled to lift its head, its small black eyes gleaming faintly in the dark. Daddy, it rasped, a sound almost lost in the downpour. Ethan knelt, his fingertips brushing its beak through the bars. It immediately pressed against his touch, a low whimper escaping its throat. All right, he said, looking up at Caleb, his voice calm. I'll sign. A mocking smile touched Caleb's lips, as if he had known all along that Ethan had no other choice. Julian stood behind him, a faint smile playing on his lips, his fingers unconsciously rubbing the suppressor patch on his neck. His gaze was fixed on Ethan, like a snake watching its prey, trembling with excitement. Ethan took the pen and signed his name. Caleb took the document, tossing it to a bodyguard, then bent down to pick up the cage. dangling it in front of Ethan. "Get on board," he said, turning toward the yacht, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The parrot is yours." The yacht's cabin was dimly lit, the air smelling faintly of disinfectant. Ethan held Blue, gently stroking its ruffled feathers. It shivered in his arms, the injury to its wing making it difficult to even stand. Caleb leaned against the bar, drinking, while Julian sat on the sofa, laughing softly at something on his phone. "The medical team is on the second deck," Caleb said suddenly, his eyes on Ethan, assessing him like an object. "A professor will be giving you a checkup shortly." Ethan's fingers paused. He looked up. "What kind of checkup?" Caleb scoffed but didn't answer. Julian, however, looked up with a sweet smile. "Just a routine prenatal checkup, of course. Caleb is worried about the baby." His affectionate tone was nauseating. Ethan didn't move, simply stroking Blue's feathers. "I don't need one." Caleb's gaze turned icy. "Ethan." He set his glass down, the sound of it hitting the marble countertop sharp and clear. "Don't make me say it again." The air grew heavy. After a few seconds of silence, Ethan finally stood up, gently placing Blue on the sofa. The parrot squawked anxiously, its claws catching on his sleeve. "Be good. I'll be back," he whispered, then looked at Caleb. "After the checkup, the parrot is mine." Caleb stared at him, then suddenly smiled. "Of course." The second deck corridor was long and narrow, lit by dim blue emergency lights. A bodyguard led him to the end and pushed open a heavy metal door. Inside, under blinding fluorescent lights, several figures in surgical scrubs were adjusting equipment. A cold light gleamed off the central operating table, and next to it, on a tray, surgical scalpels were neatly arranged. Ethan stopped in his tracks. "Mr. Lee," a doctor in a mask greeted him in a gentle tone. "Please lie down. We need to administer the anesthetic." Ethan took a step back, his back hitting the cold wall. "Just a checkup?" he asked softly. The doctor's eyes flickered before he smiled. "Yes, just a checkup." Ethan's gaze shifted to the monitor beside the operating table. It displayed a 3D simulation of a gland transplant procedure, the removal of a tulip-scented gland, every step clearly labeled. It was laughable. Such a clumsy deception. Caleb truly took him for a fool. The moment before the anesthetic entered his vein, he heard a loud explosion from a distance. The entire yacht shook violently as alarms blared through the night. "What's happening?" the doctor shouted. A panicked voice crackled over the intercom. "Raiders! We're being attacked by raiders!" Another explosion. The lights on the ceiling shattered, showering the room with glass. Ethan saw the doctors and nurses scramble for the door, which slammed shut behind them. Gunshots and screams blended into a chaotic symphony outside. The yacht tilted. He struggled, rolling off the operating table and knocking over a tray of instruments. Needles and scalpels scattered, and a deep cut opened on his palm, blood trickling down his arm. He hissed in pain, cursing inwardly. They were too rough. They should have gotten him out first. He stumbled outside onto the deck, which was engulfed in flames and thick smoke. Caleb and Julian were by a lifeboat, protected by several bodyguards. Thankfully, Blue was in the hands of one of them. "Mr. Thorne, the lifeboat won't fit everyone," someone shouted. Julian's face was pale as he clung to Caleb's arm, but Caleb's eyes were scanning the other end of the deck, where a helicopter was waiting, its rotors already spinning. But there was only room for one more person. Without hesitation, Caleb grabbed Julian and shoved him toward the helicopter. "Caleb!" Julian cried out in alarm. "Get on," Caleb commanded, then turned and yelled at the pilot, "Get him out of here." As the helicopter ascended, Ethan, holding onto the railing, met Caleb's eyes. He saw him, but it was only a glance. Then Caleb turned and jumped into the lifeboat. The yacht exploded behind him, the heat wave throwing him into the sea. As cold water filled his nose and mouth, his consciousness faded. His last thoughts were of relief. Blue was safe, and he was wearing the special protective suit his father had sent him. His father's people had put on quite a show. It was just a shame they hadn't managed to blow up Caleb and Julian along with the yacht. When he awoke, the tulips outside the window were in full, glorious bloom. Sunlight streamed onto the floor, filling the room with a warm, comforting glow. A slender figure stood silhouetted against the light by his bed. Where a gland should have been on his neck, there was only a faint scar, barely visible. Looking at him, an unexpected wave of emotion washed over Ethan. The man turned, revealing a face remarkably similar to Ethan's, but etched with the wisdom of years. A warm hand brushed the hair from his forehead. His father's voice was a mixture of pain and reproach. "Ethan, you've suffered." Ethan shook his head, taking his father's hand and placing it on his swollen belly. "I haven't suffered, Dad. The Lee family has a new heir. And just like you and me, he's a top-tier Omega." His father's fingers tightened slightly, a flash of pain in his eyes that was quickly replaced by a chilling frost. He leaned down to tuck the blanket around Ethan, his voice as rough as sandpaper. "But I'm so afraid you'll follow my path, become a broken thing like me, Dad." Ethan quickly cut him off, tilting his head to show the back of his neck. "Look, my gland is perfectly fine. Your people arrived in time. It won't be like when you—" His words caught in his throat. His father's tears were falling onto his neck, hot enough to make his heart tremble. This man had carried too much. In public, he was the powerful head of a top-tier family. In private, he endured the mockery of being a gland-damaged waste. He had once been a peak Omega, but a dynastic marriage had bound him to Ethan's biological father, a complete monster. That Alpha had tormented him with the cruelest methods, marking him repeatedly only to force him through cleansing procedures. If it weren't for Ethan being held hostage, a man as proud as his father would never have submitted. The final cleansing surgery had gone wrong, destroying his gland completely. The monster was eventually imprisoned for aggravated assault and died shortly after, allowing Ethan to finally return to his father's side. As a child, Ethan had always wanted to ask, was it worth it? To intentionally destroy his own gland during the surgery to ensure the monster was locked away, just so he could raise his son without fear? But before he could ask, his grandfather had arranged for him to be betrothed to the foolish young master of the Wei family. His father had remained silent for a long time, eventually managing to postpone the engagement for only a year. But Ethan was never destined for the Wei family, because his father, Daniel Lee, the Omega once scorned by his own family, had been weaving a net in the shadows. He had defeated his alpha uncles one by one, invited his grandfather to a quiet retirement at a separate estate, and finally seized control of the Lee family. Ethan had become his nickname. His father had given him a new formal name and designated him the next head of the family, protecting him fiercely, never allowing him to be exposed to the public until he was strong enough. Outside the circle of his father's protection, he lived and socialized as Ethan, an orphan. He remembered his 18th birthday. His father sat in the courtyard, his fingers tracing the gruesome scar on his gland, his tone chillingly calm. "Ethan, though my marriage was a mistake, I don't want you to fear love because of it." Ethan clutched his sleeve and asked in a small voice, "But what What if he turns out like that man? His father had suddenly laughed, the fine lines around his eyes crinkling with a hard-won freedom. He pinched Ethan's cheek. What's there to be afraid of? We Lees can always afford to lose. When you're in love, love with all your heart. But if one day he is no longer worthy of you, he paused, taking a sip of tea. Just consider him a premium gene donor. After all, a family as large as ours needs an heir. The teacup clinked against the pearwood table. Later, he met Caleb in Aspen. The early spring cherry blossoms hadn't bloomed yet. Caleb stood before the snow-covered mountains and took off his own scarf to wrap around Ethan's frozen ears. The tenderness in his eyes at that moment looked so much like the young Omega in his father's treasured old photographs, the one who had not yet been broken by marriage. On their 7th day, Caleb kissed him under the sweeping eaves of a mountain chapel, telling him their 98% pheromone compatibility made them destined for each other. And Ethan had believed him. It was only after the marriage that he discovered Caleb's wandering eye, the constant stream of admirers. The well-tailored suit was shed, and the mask came off. He would grab Ethan's chin and sneer, "If your gland rating wasn't so high, do you think I would have touched an orphan? If the old men in my family weren't so fixated on our high compatibility, do you think I would have gone to the trouble of marrying you?" His father was right. Love was a minor detail in life. Revenge was the main event. The operating room lights were blindingly white. Ethan's knuckles were white as he gripped the bedsheets. "Mr. Lee, the anesthesiologist is on his way." "I don't need it." He bit down on the offered cork, cold sweat soaking the pillow. "Set up the tablet." His father silently took the tablet, his fingers tapping the screen. A live stream of a memorial service from across the ocean filled the display. Caleb, dressed in a black suit, stood before a large portrait of Ethan, a white rose pinned to his chest. Julian stood half a step behind him, his eyes red-rimmed. Ethan loved the sea more than anything. Caleb's voice broke as he spoke to the cameras, his wedding ring flashing under the spotlights. He was resting on the second deck of the yacht that day. "If only I had been a little faster." He paused at the perfect moment, his throat working as he swallowed his grief. Even the vein bulging on his neck seemed like a carefully rehearsed part of the performance. A wave of contractions hit. Ethan arched his back with a muffled groan, his nails digging into his father's hand. "Ethan, don't watch this." His father tried to turn it off, but Ethan held his wrist in a death grip. "I have to watch," he gasped, a laugh bubbling up. "Watch him mourn for me." On the screen, Caleb was stroking Blue's feathers. The parrot was listless in its golden cage, ignoring the nuts offered to it. Blue hasn't spoken a word since Ethan passed. Caleb sighed for the cameras, his fingers brushing the broken bone in Blue's wing. "I will take care of him for the rest of my life." There was a crack. Ethan had bitten through the cork. How ridiculous. The alpha who had grudged him even a temporary mark in life was playing the part of a devoted saint after his death. "We see the head. Mr. Lee, push." Amidst the pain, Ethan's eyes were glued to the screen, where Caleb was now displaying the deceased's belongings. A diamond bracelet Ethan had never seen before. "I had this custom-made for our anniversary last year. I never got the chance to give it to him." He looked down, his expression one of sickening devotion. "Now I can only burn it for him. He can burn it for his own father." Ethan suddenly gripped the rails of the delivery bed and, with a final, tremendous effort, pushed. Blood soaked the sheets, pain tore through him, but he was shaking with laughter. "He's out." The baby's loud cry cut through the room. His father's hand trembled as he cut the umbilical cord. The nurse brought the blood-streaked infant to him. A beautiful Omega boy, S+ gland rating, Ethan reached out and touched the back of the baby's neck. A fresh, grassy scent emanated from it, the same scent as his father's pheromones before his gland was destroyed. Bloodlines were a strange and powerful thing. What his father had lost was reborn in his child. "Finn," he whispered, kissing the baby's wrinkled face. "My baby's name will be Finn." On the screen, the memorial was ending. Caleb's eyes were red as he faced the reporters. "I will never marry again in this life," he vowed to Ethan's portrait, his fingers unconsciously stroking Julian's waist. His father turned off the tablet and wiped Ethan's sweaty forehead with a warm cloth. "Sleep now. When you wake up, it will be their turn for sleepless nights," Ethan finished, smiling softly at Finn in his crib. He hoped Caleb's acting would be even better the next time they met. By the end of his recovery period, Finn's gland analysis report had been carefully filed away by his father in the deepest drawer of his study. S+ grade, scent of fresh grass, just like I was. His father's long fingers slowly traced the gold-embossed seal on the report. He let out a low, icy laugh. "Ethan, what do you think Caleb would do if he knew the child he abandoned was a top-tier Omega? Would he go insane?" Ethan was adjusting Finn's swaddling clothes. He looked up. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, early summer tulips swayed in the breeze, their petals still dotted with dew. He wouldn't. He bent down to kiss Finn's soft forehead, the grassy pheromones a gentle, wrapping mist. The baby's eyelashes fluttered in his sleep like a butterfly's fragile wings. The Thorne family is even more rotten than the Lees were back then. Only an idiot like Julian would believe in Caleb's sincerity. Willing to lie on an operating table and let him cut into his gland again and again. The air grew still. His father silently rubbed the edge of the report until the paper made a faint crackling sound. News from back home. Julian's gland replacement surgery was a success. His voice was heavy. He's a top-tier Omega now, but the repeated surgeries have ruined his body. He won't survive the winter. In his cradle, Finn smacked his lips, his chubby little hand unconsciously grasping Ethan's clothes. Moonlight filtered through the curtains, silvering the fine hair on his face. His child was an Omega with a coveted S+ gland. If he were powerless, would his child have fallen into the hands of someone like Caleb? "Dad, Caleb is a black-hearted monster." Ethan gently pried Finn's fingers loose and placed a kiss on his cheek. He wanted to use Julian and me to test out his black market surgical protocols. If they succeeded, how many children from ordinary families would end up on the chopping block? Julian's surgery. It means that supply chain is already operational. He looked at his father with determination. "Dad, it's time for the Lee family to go home." His father carefully covered Finn with a soft blanket. As he picked up his phone, Ethan saw the veins stand out on the back of his hand. "Proceed as planned. Extend an olive branch to the Thorne family." When Caleb received the partnership proposal from the Lee family, he was in a suburban basement, showcasing his products. Under stark white light, a dozen alphas and omegas were chained to the walls, their necks marked with price tags. The son of a wealthy businessman was prying open the eyelids of a comatose boy with his ring-laden fingers, inspecting him like livestock. "Mr. Thorne, the Lee family," an assistant handed him a tablet. On the screen, Daniel Lee's sharp profile at a signing ceremony was like a knife. The headline in gold letters was blinding. "Billion-dollar biotech park to be built in the city. Overseas Lee family makes a powerful return." "This man looks familiar." Caleb suddenly gripped the tablet, his knuckles turning white. A familiar face flashed in his mind and was gone. The businessman's son glanced over and sneered. "Just some old man with a damaged gland." His face is all he has going for him." Caleb didn't reply. He absently twisted his ring until the assistant leaned in and whispered, "The young master of the Lee family is very interested in your parrot. He says he has a soft spot for loyal little pets like that." 3 days later, Blue was placed in a solid gold cage, a ridiculously large red ribbon tied on top. Caleb himself, dressed in a formal suit with funereal black onyx cufflinks, held the cage as he stood in the Lee family's courtyard. The irony was rich. He was already in mourning for himself. Ethan watched from the shadows of a second-floor balcony, a silver mask covering his face. It was common knowledge that the Lee family heir, Ethan Lee, had been disfigured in his youth during a family feud. "Mr. Lee," Caleb called up, his face a perfect mask of ingratiating warmth, as if he were a different person from the man who had watched him fall into the sea. "Blue is very intelligent." "Heard you. Leave it there," Ethan interrupted, his voice intentionally raspy. In the cage, Blue began to flap violently, its injured wing banging against the golden bars. Its black bead eyes were fixed on him, its beak opening and closing as it managed a trembling call. "Dad, do I?" Caleb's face lit up with feigned delight. "He hasn't spoken a word since my husband passed. He even started self-harming. It seems you and Blue have a special connection, Mr. Lee." Ethan reached out and stroked Blue's sparse feathers. The parrot immediately burrowed its head into his palm, making soft, infantile noises. The bandage on its broken wing was seeping a yellowish pus that stained Ethan's fingertips. "Fate is a strange thing," his father said, stepping out from behind a pillar, the partnership agreement rustling in his hands. "Mr. Thorne, shall we discuss business?" As Caleb's eyes latched onto the figures at the bottom of the contract, Ethan could hear his breathing grow sharp and heavy. Late that night, Ethan unwrapped Blue's festering wound. The parrot trembled as the alcohol-soaked cotton touched the dead flesh, but it continued to gently preen his cufflink, as if comforting him. "You silly thing," Ethan flicked its bald head. "Following a man like that has dulled all your feathers." Blue suddenly struggled to fly toward the spiral staircase, its broken wing cutting a clumsy arc through the air. A nanny was carrying Finn downstairs. The parrot landed unsteadily on her shoulder, its black eyes fixed on the swaddled baby. "Bye, Worm. This is nice," his father's voice came from behind him. Moonlight poured through the domed skylight, bathing Blue's broken wings, Finn's waving hands, and the nanny's smiling eyes in a soft, gentle blue. Ethan looked at his own distorted reflection in the glass and answered softly, "It will be even better when Caleb is dead. Dad, our people inside the Thorne estate rescued Julian. We have our witness." Ethan rushed into the study to share the good news, but found his father staring at a glass box on his desk. It contained the taxidermied body of a sea turtle covered in barnacles. "Dad, who sent this hideous thing?" "Caleb," he said, coming back to himself. He pulled out a cigarette, the scent of tobacco filling the air as his expression grew contemplative. "I merely mentioned my frustration about my damaged gland, and he sent this. An invitation to his suburban farm in 3 days. He said I could take my pick of the glands there." The ember of the cigarette glowed. "This specimen is the entry ticket. Those who possess one form a league protecting their members. What an unexpected gift. I was just wondering how to round them all up. The darker the heart, the bolder they become, and the smaller their brains get. Just like your uncles. Just as wicked." Ethan quietly went to his father's side, resting his cheek against his warm chest. "It's all over now, Dad." On the operating table, Julian's skin had a deathly pallor, the scent of roses mixed with the stench of decay. Ethan, wearing medical gloves, pressed his fingers to the back of Julian's neck. Under the electron microscope, the much-transplanted gland looked like a ball of moldy cotton. "You're Ethan." Julian suddenly grabbed his wrist, his unfocused pupils reflecting the operating light. Ethan's lips curled into a sneer. "What? Planning to run and tell Caleb about your savior?" For once, Julian didn't snarl back. He just mumbled, "I'm not gonna make it. This body is spent. This is my karma, my karma." At the word karma, his face twisted with resentment. "Why should I go to hell alone? Caleb should be sliced into 1,000 pieces. I thought if I just got a high-grade gland, we could get married. But he treated me like a lab monkey." A sharp pain shot up from Ethan's wrist. A rattling sound came from Julian's throat, like a long and used bellows. "Ethan, after I die, you have to use my body. This body, which has undergone multiple gland transplants, is the physical evidence of Caleb's crimes." The pressure on his wrist suddenly vanished. Julian's hand fell limp. A doctor came in and pronounced him dead. The once arrogant Omega had paid with his life, all for loving a monster. If Ethan hadn't remained clear-headed, his fate would have been no better. On the day Daniel Lee and Caleb Thorne were scheduled to select glands, dozens of police cars swarmed Caleb's suburban farm. By the time reporters got wind of it and arrived, stretchers were already carrying out bruised and battered alphas and omegas. The police even discovered the buried remains of victims in the farm's rose garden. The scene was a vision of hell. With mountains of physical evidence and eyewitness testimony, the Thorne family was finished. Those who had purchased glands from Caleb were arrested one by one, their only future a legal judgment. But Caleb was never caught. He hadn't even shown up that day. It was unclear when he had sensed that something was wrong. In the mint-scented air of the police station, mixed with the smell of printer ink, the lead detective pushed a protection plan toward Ethan for the third time. Caleb is an expert at gland camouflage. The body found at the docks last week has been confirmed as a double. The detective's voice was grave. "Mr. Lee, you can apply for 24-hour police protection." Ethan finished the water in his paper cup and gave the man a grateful smile. "That won't be necessary. I can handle it. Special circumstances of self-defense were not illegal." How could he miss the opportunity to kill Caleb with his own hands? In the reflection of a baby supply store window, Caleb, wearing a muzzle-like mask, slipped out from behind a shelf. "Ethan Lee? Or should I call you by your old name?" He ripped the inhibitor collar from Ethan's neck and began to flood the air with his suppressive pheromones. Ethan feigned weakness, slumping against a shelf of pink baby products. He allowed Caleb to half-carry him out of the store and into a nearby abandoned building. "Did you know?" Caleb pulled out a syringe. "I have a gift for you." A glint of steel. Just as the needle was about to touch his skin, Ethan moved. Caleb collapsed to the ground, twitching. Ethan stood over him, holding a bottle-shaped taser, and gave him a few more jolts for good measure. In his fall, the syringe in Caleb's hand had accidentally plunged into his own gland. By the time the police arrived, Caleb was foaming at the mouth. The syringe had been filled with poison. Ethan would never tell anyone that when he tossed Caleb, he had deliberately angled the thrust, using the force to ensure the needle found its mark. While his initial desire was to carve Caleb into 1,000 pieces with a knife, this method of turning his own weapon against him was far more elegant. 3 years after Caleb's conviction, Ethan stood on the stage at a press conference for the Lee family's medical corporation. He pressed the activation button. A beam of light shot out from the non-invasive gland therapy device. On the large screen, the gland changes of Omega volunteers were displayed in real time. Alpha pheromones moved beneath their skin, but no longer triggered any corresponding hormonal fluctuations. This meant that, if they chose, omegas could finally be free from their biological submission to alphas. "Mommy!" A 3.5-year-old Finn rushed backstage, holding up a science award from his kindergarten. "I invented a pheromone paintbrush that can turn smells into colors." Ethan looked out the window. The sanatorium that had once imprisoned Julian had been converted into a gland museum. His father walked in, holding Blue. The parrot's beak gently pecked at his pheromone suppressor patch. "Go home. Go home." The evening breeze swept through the garden. The tulips that Caleb had once ordered destroyed had surged back from the earth, creating a sea of color. Ethan took Finn's small hand, their feet making 2 parallel paths in the flower bed, like the sharp, clean cuts of a blade severing a chain.